Now we will see how Coleridge differentiates between fancy and imagination. So we have already been through what is primary imagination and what is secondary imagination, and how secondary imagination is a more superior and a more evolved faculty or ability as compared to primary imagination. Right now, what does Coleridge mean by fancy? So, by fancy, he is referring to a memory. Fancy is nothing creative, it is a mere ingredient. And here, Coleridge very interestingly uses the metaphor of, he uses an example, or he borrows from the discipline of chemistry to give us the difference between fancy and imagination. So he says the difference between fancy and imagination is exactly like the difference between a mixture and a chemical compound. So, what happens in a mixture? In a mixture, different ingredients are mixed. So, for example, if you mix salt and sugar, right? Salt and sugar could be mixed, and the resultant mixture would contain salt and sugar both. So, neither will lose their identity, right? So, the resultant mixture of salt and sugar will very clearly show us the presence of salt and sugar. But on the other hand, if you kind of do a chemical reaction with hydrogen and oxygen and form water, you cannot see hydrogen and oxygen separately. That has become a compound now. So it's the result of a chemical fusion. So he says imagination, that which comes out of imagination, is akin to a chemical fusion where the ingredients have not they do not retain their former identities, right? You cannot separate them again. But in case of fancy, it is just a part of a mixture where it retains its individual identity. So it could be just one stray memory, or it could be an event, or it could be an impression, but it has not undergone that transformation or that metamorphosis which will result in a creative outcome, or which has result in a totally different outcome. So that is what he means by fancy. He says fancy is not a creative power at all. It only combines that which it perceives into beautiful shapes. But like the imagination, it neither unifies, nor does it synthesize, nor does it fuse. The difference between the two is the same as that between a mixture and a compound. And also, he refers to fancy as a mechanical juxtaposition and not chemical fusion. So, you can juxtapose, you can place things next to each other, you can place things with each other or inside each other, but that does not change the reality, that does not change their true nature. And that is exactly what fancy is. So, in a chemical compound, the different ingredients combine and they form something entirely new. So, a creative artistic composition is like the result of a chemical compound. Whereas, if you look at fancy, it is just something that arbitrarily brings together images, and even when brought together, they continue to retain their separate and their individual properties.